Howdy folks, and welcome to the World of Tanks patch 9.10 test server, where the main focus is on the brand new line of Japanese heavy and super heavy tanks. These tanks are not the kind of machines that are ever going to win any beauty contests. These are the kind of tanks that only their mother could love. They, as a rule, look pretty primitive, and there's actually a very good reason for that. Most of these new Japanese heavy tanks never really existed at the very best prototype, but in most cases just blueprint form. And just looking at the way the tanks have been put together really does betray the immaturity of the Japanese tank development industry. If you have a look here at the Japanese Oni heavy tank, you can see that it's not welded, it's not cast. All of the armour plates are riveted together. And as everybody else who was building tanks discovered the hard way, that's bad news when you get hit and the rivets start popping off and flying around the inside of the tank. Japan actually had the 5th largest number of tanks of any of the combatants in World War II, behind the Soviet Union, Germany, Britain, the USA and France. But the tanks that they had weren't really suited for tank-to-tank combat. Most of Japan's tanks were developed for the infantry support role, a decision that was going to come and bite them in the arse in 1939 at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, when the Japanese 6th Army was comprehensively defeated by the Soviets, due in large part to the fact that they didn't have any guns on their tanks that were capable of dealing with other tanks, whereas the Soviet tanks, armed with the ubiquitous 45mm gun, were entirely capable of dealing with the small Japanese light and medium tanks. And the lessons of the Battle of Khalkhin Gol took a long time to be absorbed by Japanese Army High Command, at which point it was too late, because after 1941, Japanese industry was focused on producing ships and aircraft. And it was focused on producing ships and aircraft rather than tanks, for a very good reason. It's difficult to fight with tanks across the length of the Pacific when you're engaged in a war with the US Navy. And so, while Japan did maintain a relatively large number of tanks, at least comparable to the tank forces fielded by Italy, the tanks that they had were obsolete, light and very small medium tanks. In fact, even some of the newer and more modern designs that the Japanese Army High Command managed to get off the drawing board and into the factories were considered out of date by Western standards, even as they were rolling out of the factory gates. Nevertheless, despite this lack of sophistication in the Japanese tank industry, the majority of the Japanese tanks were being used in mainland China against the Chinese, and the Chinese didn't have any tanks of their own, and they had very little in the way of anti-tank weapons. So there was never a driving need for the Japanese to develop more and better tanks, and even if there had been, they wouldn't have been able to because they didn't have the resources, and the resources that they did have were given over to the Navy and the Air Force as a priority. And that, of course, is why it's taken so long for Wargaming to get around to implementing a heavy tank line for the Japanese here in World of Tanks. Because they pretty much had to pull most of these designs out of their arses. Because Japan just didn't have any heavy tanks. They did, of course, have a couple of designs. The Japanese Super Heavy O1 or OI, I'm not entirely sure which it is, did exist in design form. It was rumoured that a prototype was built and shipped to Manchuria, but nobody's ever found a photograph of it, and it only exists in blueprints. So Wargaming really did not have a lot to work with when it came around to designing these Japanese heavy tanks, but they've managed to get them in, and we're going to take a look at them. Now, one thing that I do have to get out of the way right now before we go any further is that my overall impressions of the Japanese heavies are obviously going to be coloured by the fact that I've been playing them on the test server. And there are certain things that happen on the test server that just don't happen when you're playing on the live server. For a start, everybody has access to an almost infinite supply of gold ammunition. And when you're constantly rolling into Jagdpanzer E100s that are emptying their pockets and launching 420mm of penetration at you, well, when you're driving a nation that relies on the thickness of its armour more than any other nation in the game for the survival of its heavy tanks, it can be an intensely frustrating experience. Nevertheless, you can still get an idea of how these tanks are likely to perform under normal circumstances on the live server in a random battle. And so we're going to have a look at each of the new tanks that have been introduced, and we're going to have a quick look at the stats, get an idea of how you can expect them to perform, what the good points and the bad points are, and then we're going to give you some practical demonstrations of how they actually perform in battle. The first of the new Japanese heavies isn't actually a Japanese heavy, it's a tier 2 medium. This is it, the Type 89. This thing was developed in the 1920s to replace the Type 87, which at a massive whopping weight of 18 tons was considered too heavy and too slow to perform its role. You can quite clearly see from looking at it that it's heavily influenced by the design of the French Renault FT. It was equipped with a 57mm gun, and it weighed 12.5 tons, and nobody really cares because it's tier 2. So yeah, anyway, let's move on. What do we have at tier 3? At tier 3 we have the first actual Japanese heavy tank. This is the Type 91 Heavy. It's not particularly heavy, it only weighs 20.4 tons. It's got heavy tank speed, 25 km per hour, but it definitely does not have heavy tank armour. 20 at the front, 15 at the sides and rear on the hull, and 20 all round on the turret. It does, however, have this 47mm gun Type 1, which historically was the gun that was developed by the Japanese army for their tanks as a means of giving them something that was actually capable of killing other tanks. This was the first lesson that they did actually learn from their mauling at the hands of the Soviets at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. And it's not a bad little gun, very fast rate of fire, good penetration for a tier 3 tank, 81mm, 122 with premium, 70 damage, again not great, but with that kind of rate of fire it soon adds up, horrible accuracy, 0.4, and a very good aiming time of 2.1 seconds. Other than the gun, which is pretty good, it's a largely unremarkable tank. But again, it's only tier 3, nobody really cares that much. And then we get to tier 4. The Type 95 Heavy, like its predecessor at tier 3, initially doesn't look like anything at all to get excited about. It's got a terrible top speed of 22 km per hour. The armour is bad, 35mm thick at the most, and again it's all flat slab-sided armour construction. But then we come to the gun, and once again we get quite a pleasant surprise. This 75mm gun has 70mm of penetration and 110 average damage. Now that's the same average damage and almost double the penetration of the 75mm gun equipped on both of the German tier 4 medium tanks and the German tier 4 heavy tank, the Durchbruchswagen. In fact, it's the same average damage and not that much less penetration than the 75mm shotgun on the M3 Lee, and unlike the M3 Lee, this thing has a turret, so it can fire around right-hand corners the way the M3 Lee can't. It also has 430 health, which is not bad for a tier 4 at all. In fact, it's approaching tier 5 medium tank standards, and is 120 more health than the M3 Lee. This is, despite its butt-ugly appearance, not a bad tank, and is probably going to be quite popular at tier 4. But still, it is just the tier 4. At tier 5, however, we finally start to get a taste for what the Japanese heavy tanks are actually going to be like with the OI Experimental, and this thing is huge. It weighs over 100 tons, it has a 1200 horsepower engine, and thanks to some kind of miracle of Japanese engineering, that means it can actually produce a top speed, and reliably reach that top speed of 40 kilometers per hour. We also start to see some of the characteristics that you're going to expect to see on most of the other Japanese heavy tanks from this point on, and specifically I'm talking about the armour here. Now, while the armour on the OI Experimental is not particularly thick, it's anything between 70 and 75mm, but it's consistent because it's anything between 70 and 75mm all around, front, sides and rear. The armour is, of course, completely flat. I mean, look at the sides of the tank. This thing's actually been described as the TOG-2, but with tits. As you can see by those two completely cosmetic turrets on the front of the upper glacis there. The armour, while it's consistent, it's not particularly thick, which means that down here at tier 5, you're going to have to start learning how to angle the armour of your tank in order to survive in battle. And that's a lesson that if you start learning down here at tier 5 with the Japanese heavies is going to pay you in very, very good stead by the time you get up to tier 10 in the Japanese heavies. Because angling the armour in the Japanese tier 10, the Type 5 heavy, is going to make that thing practically invulnerable. But we'll get onto that later. For now, let's take a closer look at the OI Experimental, specifically the guns, because it has quite an interesting selection of guns. The first gun that you're going to be using on this tank isn't bad. It's the 7.5cm tank gun Type 5. It has 16.67 rounds per minute, 124mm of penetration with armor piercing, 125 average damage, 0.39 accuracy, a very good 2.2 second aiming time. It's basically the functional equivalent of the 76mm M1A1 gun that you get on the American M4 Sherman. It's basically a tier 5 medium tank gun. Your next gun choice is this not terribly imaginatively named 12cm short barrel gun. It's a howitzer, it's a derp gun. It has a rate of fire of 6.25 rounds per minute. With its armour piercing ammunition you have a terrible 60mm of penetration, but you do get 360 average damage, The gold ammunition for this thing, the premium ammunition, is high explosive anti-tank, which does have 140mm of penetration to go with that 360 average damage. And if you're firing high explosive, you also get 60mm of penetration with 440 average damage. There is literally no reason whatsoever to be firing the standard armor-piercing ammunition with this gun. It has exactly the same penetration and way less damage than the high explosive. This thing is going to be for spamming high explosive or premium high explosive anti-tank ammunition. The accuracy, as you'd expect of a derp gun, is absolutely terrible, 0.54. The aiming time isn't bad though, 2.6 seconds. But it's probably not the gun that you're going to be using on this tank, because once you've unlocked the 100mm gun, yes, this tank gets a 100mm gun. There is literally no reason to be using anything else. It's got a comparable rate of fire to the 120mm howitzer, but it has 130mm of penetration with its armor-piercing standard ammunition and 300 average damage. The accuracy is pretty bad, 0.41, but you'd better start getting used to that with your Japanese heavy tanks. And again, the aiming time is a perfectly acceptable 2.6 seconds. But this is where things start getting interesting, because the premium ammunition on this tank is not high explosive anti-tank, it's not APCR, it's just armor piercing, exactly the same as the regular ammunition. It doesn't have that much more penetration than the standard ammunition, it's 150mm, as opposed to the regular 130. But the thing about armor piercing ammunition is it gets the full 5 degrees of normalization when it hits enemy armor. APCR, while it does travel through the air to the target faster than regular armor piercing, only gets 3 degrees of normalization, and high explosive anti-tank doesn't get any. What the hell's normalization, Jingles? Well, I don't want to bore you with science, and put in simple layman's terms, what it means is that if you're firing at a target that is heavily angled or heavily sloped, you stand a better chance of penetrating, with the shot actually screwing its way into the armor and doing damage to that tank if you're firing armor piercing rather than APCR or high explosive anti-tank. And this is a trend that continues on pretty much all of the Japanese heavy tanks from this point up. The premium ammunition is armor piercing, just the same as the regular ammunition, except it has more penetration. I do actually quite like the OI Experimental. It's not a bad tank at all. In fact, it's pretty damn good. It's quite fast. It's certainly pretty mobile. It's got a great gun. It might look like a bulldog licking piss off a nettle, but World of Tanks isn't a beauty contest, and it also has a lot of health, 700 hit points, which ties with the Churchill 1 and the Churchill 3 for having the most health of any of the Tier 5 heavy tanks. It's not very pretty, but it does get the job done. So what kind of fun do we have lying in wait for us at Tier 6? Well, at Tier 5 you have the OI Experimental, so naturally at Tier 6 you have the OI, and we're definitely going to have to come up with better nicknames for these tanks. Now, the OI can use the same 100mm gun that the OI Experimental used at Tier 5, and naturally, while the hard stats like the penetration and the damage are going to be exactly the same, the soft stats like the gun handling, the aiming time, the accuracy, the rate of fire is going to be better. But there's a much more fun option, because this is basically the Japanese KV-2. This 15cm howitzer Type 96 is not a bad gun at all. Its rate of fire is 2.4 rounds per minute, which is just slightly less than the 2.5 rounds per minute that you get on the KV-2. It has 121mm of penetration with armor piercing, which is better than the KV-2, and the same 700 average damage as the KV-2. With its high explosive anti-tank ammunition, it has 150mm of penetration, which again is better than the KV-2 with similar ammunition, and again the same 700 average damage. It has slightly less penetration with its high explosive, 75mm, which is still more than enough to penetrate the armour of any Tier 5 medium tank, and 910 average damage. It's got a better accuracy than the KV-2. It's still pretty bad at 0.58, and it's got a better aiming time than the KV-2, but it's still pretty bad at 3.7. It's a monstrously fun derp gun. And you know why we love derp guns? We love derp guns because doing stuff like this. Come on, where is he? Where is he? There he is. Yep, that never gets old. And unlike the KV-2, this thing actually has some very, very good armour. It's 150mm at the front. The side armour, at least on the hull, is only 70mm, so you're going to have to angle the tank. But the turret is 150mm all round, and it's 150mm at the rear of the tank as well. It is of course going to need all of that armour, and it's going to need that whopping 970 hit points as well, because this tier 6 heavy tank weighs 152 tons. Just look at this thing compared to the KV2. and the KV2 is not a small tank. In fact, hang on, let's just compare this thing to, oh I don't know, the E100. Yeah, I think we can safely say the Japanese like them big, which is just as well because they don't get much smaller from here on up. Let's have a look at the tier 7. And here it is, the Oni. This is a difficult tank to love playing on the test server. I suspect this tank is actually going to be quite good on the live server, where people aren't as quick to empty their pockets at you as they are on the test server, where, well, you know, why not fire nothing but high explosive anti-tank ammunition? Having said that, however, the armour on this tank is very, very strong, and with some careful angling, even if people are firing gold at you, you can still bounce shots in this thing, which does suggest that it is going to be a very, very strong tank, particularly in a tier 7 match on the live server. I mean, tanks like the IS over there, the Su-122-44, the old Stalin's Hammer, with their 122mm guns, they have around about 220mm of penetration, firing APCR, which I have no doubt they are because it's the test server. The Panther on the top of the hill was able to penetrate me with his 198mm of penetration. But guys like this, well, they pretty much have to get close enough to hit weak spots like my Glacis cheeks in order to penetrate. And I am reliably able to bounce shots from them just by continually moving backwards and forwards and denying them shots at those weak spots. Of course, when you're just moving backwards and forwards a little bit, in a tank as massive and slow as this, you're a sitting duck for artillery, and that's going to be probably the single biggest bane of your existence in these Japanese super heavy tanks, as I just got rebalanced by that S51 there. The gun selection available on this tank is also not bad at all. For a start, you've got this 10cm cannon Type 92, and it does compare quite favourably in most respects with that staple of the Soviet tier 7s, the 122mm D25T. It's got a better rate of fire, the penetration is the same, 175mm, the average damage is substantially less than the 390 that the Russians get. It's 300, which is still pretty good, but it's more accurate, and it's got a better aiming time. You move up from there, you can use the same 150mm howitzer that we were having so much fun with at tier 6, and the soft stats are better, but you're probably going to want to be using this 10cm experimental tank gun, because it basically takes a huge dump from a very great height all over that Russian D25T 122mm gun that we see so much in tier 7 battles. Better rate of fire, better penetration, better accuracy, better aiming time, and it's got 30 more damage than the previous 100mm gun for a 330 alpha damage, which again isn't as much as the Soviet 390, but it's going to fire more often, it's going to hit more often, it's going to penetrate more often, so it's probably going to be doing more damage overall. It's not a bad selection of guns whatsoever. And you'd better learn to like them, because you're going to be using them all again at tier 8 on the tier 8 super heavy Japanese tank, the Oho. There's the 10cm tank gun Type 92, there's the 150mm howitzer, and there is the 10cm experimental tank gun Kai, which I believe means improved, or is just a fancy way of saying, yes, it's the same gun, but we're going to give you more penetration as well, because now we're at tier 8. The mobility of this tank is definitely not its strong suit. It has a 25km/h top speed, which is kind of bizarre because remember the tier 5, which weighs only around about 18 tons less than this tank and also has 1200 horses under the bonnet, and that thing manages to do 40km/h because, you know, reasons. But the armour on this tank is definitely where it's at. It's 200mm all around on the turret, and the hull is 200 at the front, 150 at the rear, and 105, significantly better than the 70 that we've seen previously, on the sides. Again, it's kind of flat and boxy, but there's better sloping going on than on the tier 7. It's definitely, as is pretty routine by now, not one of the prettiest tanks in the world. In fact, it's downright ugly, but that armour does work. Even on the test server, where you have to expect everybody is firing gold ammunition at you given the choice. T69 there, with his high explosive anti-tank ammunition, he has 250mm of penetration, and you're going to hear the distinctive sizzle when he does penetrate my spaced armour covering my tracks but fails to penetrate the tank. Any second now, there you go, heat ammunition. 250mm of penetration, shot at the front of the tank twice, failed to penetrate, even though the actual physical thickness of the armour is only 200 millimeters. You have to angle the tank. AMX over there with his 120mm gun, he has 325mm of penetration, firing APCR. Of course, this does work both ways, because I'm using the howitzer rather than the 10cm gun, and even with premium ammunition, this only has 150mm of penetration, and the front of that AMX-48, who I have just bounced a shot from with his 325mm of penetration, but the front of his tank is 150mm thick, and it's sloped back, and with 0.54 accuracy on the howitzer, I can't even hit a weak spot, so yeah. And oh great, they've managed to work their way around me, and, and here it comes. But just let me get one shot on this guy with a howitzer. Come on, show me the side of the tank. Come on, do it. You know you want to. Come on, do it for YouTube. There it is, and that's why we use the howitzer. Because it may not be very practical, but it sure is fun. And in stereotypical angry Russian kid fashion, right after finally working his way around the flank and making his ammunition work on me, the T69 turns around and team kills the AMX-48, because it's the test server. And that's what people do here. It's one of the reasons why I despise playing on the test server. But anyway, the tank. You can quite clearly see that even in the most hostile environment possible, playing on the test server, it is entirely possible, provided you know where the shots are coming from, that you can angle this tank and bounce almost everything fired at you, especially in a Tier 8 match. In fact, I think this tank might be slightly overpowered in a Tier 8 game, and the armour is still pretty strong in a Tier 9 or a Tier 10 match, where people are routinely going to have the kind of penetration that you associate with premium ammunition in a Tier 8 match. The one fly in the ointment is the tank's mobility, which is bad. 25 km/h top speed is just... it's frustrating, because it's so easy with tanks that are as slow as this to just get left behind the flow of the battle. And by the time you catch up, there's either nothing left to kill or all your team are dead, and, well, you just get outflanked because you can only do 25 km/h. That is a significant problem with the OHO, the Japanese Tier 8. Lack of mobility is definitely the general Achilles heel of these Japanese super heavy tanks, and as you'd expect, they are super heavy tanks after all. But that lack of mobility affects certain of these tanks far, far worse than it does others. And that neatly brings us on to the Japanese Tier 9, the Type 4 Heavy. The Type 4 Heavy at Tier 9 on paper looks like a very, very capable tank, and in most respects it is. There's not a lot of difference between the Type 4 Heavy at Tier 9 and the Type 5 Heavy at Tier 10. In fact, if you were to place the two tanks side by side, you'd have a hard time telling the difference between them just by looking at them. Of course there are some differences. They both use the same 140mm gun. It's very similar to the 150mm gun that you get on the E100. Even though it's the same gun, however, because one tank's a Tier 9 and one tank's a Tier 10, the soft stats, things like the accuracy, the aiming time and the reload speed, are worse on the Tier 9 than they are on the Tier 10. Here at Tier 9, it has a 2.88 round per minute reload, which is very slow. It has 249mm of penetration with standard ammunition, 282 with premium, 70 with high explosive, and does 600 average damage with both flavours of armour piercing, and 770 with its high explosive. The accuracy of 0.42 and the aiming time of 2.9 seconds, well, we're getting kind of used to this with the Japanese heavy tanks at this stage. The accuracy on all of them is absolutely dreadful. The gun, despite the slow reload, isn't that bad. The armour as well is very, very favourable, and not that much worse than on the Tier 10, and you can bounce shots like nobody's business even on the test server in this thing. The front of the turret is 250mm thick, the sides are 140 and the rear is 150. The hull is 250mm thick at the front, 200 at the sides and 200 at the rear. In fact, what is absolutely comical when you're driving one of these tanks, and you get this when two of the Tier 10s come across each other as well, is when you're in a Type 4 Heavy and you come across another Type 4 Heavy, you just can't penetrate each other. Even firing gold ammunition, you have to hit weak spots like the commander's hatch on top, which is not an easy target to hit, because it's a big round sloped target. If you don't hit it square on, and you know, if your team can stay alive for longer than 2 minutes, oh, what are you going to do? I actually bounced... I mean, this match has not lasted very long, and I've already bounced 3,000 hit points worth of damage here. It is a ferociously well-armoured tank. The armour and the gun are not the problem with this tank. The problem is the mobility. This tank has a top speed of 20 km per hour, 5 km per hour less than the Tier 10. It weighs more than the Tier 10. Fully loaded, this thing will clock in at over 161 tons. It has the same engine as the Tier 10. They both have 1200 horsepower engines. Most of these Japanese tanks have 1200 horsepower engines because most of them weigh over 100 tons. The Type 4, however, must have the worst suspension and transmission in the game because it just cannot make use of that 1200 horsepower engine. This tank is slow to begin with, but if you try to take it up the slightest incline, it struggles to get over 10 kilometers per hour. And you know what it's like when you're driving a really, really slow tank, when everybody else in your team is not driving a really, really slow tank. Drivers of T95s, the infamous Doom Turtle, will know exactly what I'm talking about. That's what it's like driving the Type 4 Heavy, or struggling to drive the Type 4 Heavy absolutely anywhere. The armour on this tank is great. It's not impenetrable. I mean, like the mouse and the E100, when you're not ready to pull the trigger, you have to point the turret away from whoever's shooting at you. The IS-4 up there, for example, with his 122mm gun firing high explosive anti-tank, has 340mm of penetration. And he will put one through your gun mantlet if you just keep pointing the turret straight at him. Test server, you know. But providing you take sensible precautions, you angle the hull of the tank. You turn the turret away from whoever's shooting back at you until you're ready to shoot at them. You can definitely make the armour of this tank work. The gun, well, it's a brawling tank. The Japanese tanks, the heavies anyway, are brawling close-range fighters. The problem, of course, is getting close enough to the enemy tanks where you can actually put this very inaccurate but very powerful 140mm gun to work. It just takes forever. This is one of those tanks where you're going to be in the ironic situation of cursing your team for being good. Because they're not going to leave anything for you to shoot. You're constantly going to be playing catch up, trying to keep up with the flow of the battle and just looking for things that you can point the gun at and reliably hit. But your team aren't going to leave you anything. Which is pretty much exactly what happened in this game. I've fired one shot so far, hit a side-scraping IS-4 and bounced because I'm not using the premium ammunition. And I've only just now gotten into a position where I'm actually able to start shooting at anything else, and half of the enemy team are dead. So here we go, and it's another Type 4, and I bounce off him, he bounces off me. Why couldn't it have been anything but another Type 4? I'm going to have to hit a weak spot, while at the same time not allowing him to shoot at one of my weak spots. Give me that commander's hatch. He's hit. Yeah, alright, come on. There you go, bingo. And that's the only damage I did this entire game. I never stopped moving for the rest of this match, and there just wasn't anything left for me to shoot at by the time my team had got done with them. You're going to have a lot of games like this in the Type 4. The mobility is an absolute millstone around your neck when you're driving this horrible, horrible machine. Look at that. I only fired 2 shots this entire game, and I was moving forward as fast as I could. That, unfortunately, is the curse of the Type 4 Heavy. It's a bloody awful machine. But it's the first time I can actually say that in the entire Japanese Super Heavy tank line so far. That's not to say that none of the other Japanese Super Heavies have problems. Of course they do, but none of them cripple your gameplay quite as much as the appalling mobility of the Type 4 Heavy. I have actually managed to exceed the 20 km per hour speed limit on this machine. I did once manage to clock 22 km per hour while taking it for a spin down a hill. I thought I was going to get a nosebleed, it was going that fast. Oh, this is a bad tank. It really, really is. And it's just that one thing that compounds everything else that's borderline bad about the machine. Like the gun, for example. The accuracy of the gun is... Oh, what's this? I think there's a T92 on the enemy team is just around this corner. Both me and the other Type 4 are going to take a shot at him. Get a load of this. This is why you have to get close to use this gun. It's exactly the same as when you're driving the E100. Unfortunately, you can't get close to use this gun unless you're the one being attacked, because it's just too slow. Where is he? There he is. What's this? Fully aimed shot. Admittedly, there's not an awful lot of him to shoot at. And so I miss. But look at the Type 4 in front of me. He's only 50 meters away. And he misses as well. Yeah. Yeah, the Type 4 Heavy is not a good tank at all. On the bright side, however, it does lead to the Type 5 Heavy. And the Type 5 Heavy is pretty damn impressive. The Type 5 Heavy, we've finally got there. This is the Japanese Tier 10 Heavy tank. It has 2,800 hit points, which means it's second only to the Mouse with 3,000 hit points for having the most health of any tank in World of Tanks. Fully loaded, it weighs just a fraction over 150 tons, which is at least 10 tons lighter than the Type 4 Heavy at Tier 9. They both share a 1200 horsepower engine. The Type 5, however, has a top speed of 25 kilometers per hour, which is just barely fast enough to not be a disastrously slow machine like the Type 4 is, but it also seems to handle better than the Type 4. You don't really feel, while this is by no stretch of the imagination a fast tank, it's definitely not, but you don't feel as terribly constricted as you do in the Type 4 when you're driving the Type 5. The armour is phenomenally good. The turret is 260mm at the front, 140 at the side and 150 at the rear. The hull, 260 at the front, 210 at the side and 200 at the rear. It has a 400 metre view range, a 750 metre signal range. It shares the same 140mm gun as the Type 4 Heavy at Tier 9, but the stats are way better. The rate of fire, while still slow, 3.39 rounds per minute, better than the Type 4. The damage and penetration are exactly the same. It is, at the end of the day, the same gun. 249 with armour piercing, 282 with premium armour piercing, 70 with high explosive, 600 damage for both flavours of armour piercing, 770 damage with the high explosive. It's more accurate while still being pretty inaccurate with 0.4 accuracy. Again, you still have to get this tank up close and personal in order to reliably do damage with it, but it does have a pretty good aiming time of 2.5 seconds. But it's the armour of this tank that's going to make you love it. That was a 121 Tier 10 Chinese medium tank firing high explosive anti-tank ammunition with 340mm of penetration. Hit the front of the Type 5, didn't penetrate. You would be astounded, even on the test server, of the amount of shots that you bounce when you're driving this tank. Leopard 1 up there, he's firing high explosive anti-tank ammunition because he's going to penetrate me as I'm crossing this open ground here. I do actually manage to hit him and do a hell of a lot more damage to him than he did to me. I take 2 hits, both in the flank, crossing the open ground. Enemy tanks up ahead. Looks like they're all sitting here waiting for me to arrive. Okay, fine, no problem. I am in a very, very heavily armoured Tier 10 Heavy. After all, this is my job. This tank is going to be incredibly good at side scraping, and I'm trying to do it on this corner here, but, well, there's too many of them around the other side, and there's too many of my tanks that I'm basically blocking from getting up here and supporting me. I bounce a shot from the enemy Type 5. Here comes the Jagdpanzer E100. I bounce a shot from the 113. I don't want to get hit by the Jagdpanzer E100 because his gold ammo has 420mm of penetration, and no amount of angling or side scraping is going to protect me from that. Here he comes. There's the Type 5. Blow his tracks off. Goes right through. Does damage. Here comes the Type 5. Turn the turret away. Bounce a shot from him. He'll be firing the premium armour piercing, which has over 280mm of penetration. And there's the Jagdpanzer E100. Premium ammunition on that thing. 420mm of penetration. There's only so much you can do no matter what you're driving. Oh, turn the turret away. Bounce another shot from the Type 5. Bounce another shot from the 113, bounce one shot from the Waffenträger E100. He penetrates with his second shot. And he's dead. I didn't get the kill, but yeah, what the hell. Fall back, wait to reload. 113 pops out, blows off my tracks, no problem. Tracks repaired. not quite ready to fire, turn the turret away, bounce another shot. The armour on this tank is phenomenal, even when people are emptying their pockets at you and firing gold shot after shot after shot. Of course, when there's a Jagdpanzer E100 around on the test server with his 420mm of premium ammunition penetration, as I said, there's only so much you can do. But that brief encounter there, where in the space of about a minute I bounced 3,000 points worth of damage from tanks who were all firing at me with gold penetration values ranging between 330 to 350, 360mm of penetration, and the only two that managed to penetrate me from the front while I was angling and turning the turret aside were the Jagdpanzer E100 and one of two shots from the Waffenträger E100. That tells you just how powerful the armour of this tank is going to be when you're playing on the live server. At close ranges like that, which is what this tank is designed for, it's going to be an absolute monster. And just to get an idea of exactly how tough the armour of this tank is under regular circumstances, I thought I'd take it into a training room and just fire some shots at it to see just what it took to get through the armour of this machine under controlled circumstances. With regular ammunition loaded, which has 249mm of penetration, you can see that my armour penetration indicator is turning yellow, which means that I might penetrate, but then again, I might not. And that's pretty much everywhere over the front of the tank, other than the cheeks at the sides of the upper glacis. They are, however, angled. The lower glacis? Nah. I mean, I'll take the shot, but it's just at too steep an angle to bounce. Remember, the armour penetration indicator just looks at raw armour thickness. It doesn't care about the sloping or the angling from whichever angle you're aiming at. It just tells you if you were firing straight on at that armour, could you penetrate? Straight on like that, you cannot penetrate with regular ammunition the side cheeks, which are the only real frontal weak spot on this tank. At an extreme angle like that, you're obviously always going to bounce when shooting at the side of the turret. So we're going to reload and we're going to go for the commander's hatch at the top, except first I'm going to aim slightly, just slightly to the side, just to show you how tough this thing is as well if you don't hit it square on. Yep, that bounces too. When somebody is at close range in your Type 5 and they're aiming for your commander's hatch, just keep moving backwards and forwards and wiggling your turret from side to side. Make it as hard as possible for them to do that right there, because that will penetrate if they hit it square on. Okay, so that's your regular ammunition, 249mm of penetration. Now I'm going to load the premium armour piercing, which has 282mm of penetration, and see how that fares under the same circumstances. And you can see by the yellow colour of my armour penetration indicator on my aiming reticle that even with 282mm of penetration, there's no flat surface at the front of this tank that I am guaranteed to reliably penetrate, except for there. Those two bulges at the front of the lower glacis of the tank where the transmission connects to the drive wheels. That can be penetrated at ranges of less than 100 metres by this 140mm gun with its 282mm of penetration. So how about if we angle it? Can we still penetrate those bulges where the transmission meets the front drive wheels if we turn the tank an angle of about 30 degrees? Let's have a look. Let's go for the one on the other side here. And yep, you can still penetrate those. Okay, so those are a weak spot if you have sufficient penetration. How about the side armour? 30 degrees of angling. Let's say we're side scraping this tank. We still have to get through the spaced armour on the side and the tracks and the 140mm of side armour. Nope, that is a bounce. Okay, when we're angled like this, however, those cheek plates at the top of the upper glacis, they're no longer gaining any kind of angling protection. We've actually made those easier to penetrate. So with standard ammunition, 249mm of penetration, can we get through those when the tank is angled at 30 degrees? And no, we can't. And that was actually very surprising. Alright, we'll try that again, but this time with the premium armour piercing. Again, 282mm of penetration. With the tank angled towards us at an angle of about 30 degrees, this seems to be the ideal amount of angling that you need to put into the tank in order to protect yourself from the maximum possible amount of fire. And of course with 282mm of penetration we can get through those cheeks, which only have at this kind of facing, about 5 to 10 degrees of angle, but it was surprising that we needed the premium ammunition in order to get through. I've switched back to the regular ammunition again, and I'm going to try to get through the side of the turret. Now, in this kind of situation, and it doesn't get through the side of the turret, what we're doing here is we're imagining that this guy's perhaps side scraping around a corner, or he's just angling to try to absorb fire from me. He's reloading, and he's not pointing his turret straight towards me to make it easier for me to penetrate his turret front. And even with the premium ammunition, at that kind of angle, you can't even penetrate the side of the turret. So it seems to be that angling the tank at an angle of about 30 degrees, and between shots keeping your turret and gun pointed straight ahead, is the way to do it in the Type 5 Heavy. So those are the new Japanese tanks coming your way in World of Tanks patch 9.10. I have to admit, I didn't expect them to be as good as they were. I mean, they're all ugly as sin. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But as I said at the beginning, World of Tanks is not a beauty contest, and these tanks, by and large, have it where it counts. More so than I was expecting because of, well, the nature of how they're designed, just great big blocks and slabs of metal. But they're very thick, great big blocks and slabs of metal, and if they're not innately thick, they become very thick by just angling the tank, and it does make these tanks quite effective. The guns pretty much across the board are desperately inaccurate, but they work. They're the kind of guns that you want on the kind of tanks that they are. These are not the kind of tanks that should be sitting around at the back of the map behind the tank destroyers, although I'm sure it's going to happen because, you know, World of Tanks. These are the kind of guns that you put on tanks that are designed to get up close and personal and take the fight right into the enemy's face, because that's just what these tanks are best at. It's where their armour works best, and it's where their guns work best. If you like the sound of that, then the Japanese heavies are definitely the tanks for you, providing you put up with their god-awful looks. I mean, I don't like these tanks very much, but not for any practical reason. I'm very shallow and superficial. I just don't like the way they look. I like my tanks to be sexy, like the Tiger, and if they can't be sexy, let them at least be cute, like the Panzer II looks, and if they can't be cute or sexy, let them at least look unique, like the TOG 2. These tanks have none of that. You can't even say they look unique because they all look the same as each other. But they certainly have it where it counts. These are surprisingly good tanks. And so that's it for my World of Tanks patch 9.10 test server preview video. It's another 40-minute plus video. Oh, how I have been spoiling you over the course of the last couple of days. And this is probably going to be the last video that I upload until I get back from my 5 days in Manhattan, the first vacation I've had in something like 4 years. There may be another video tomorrow, possibly, but if there is, it'll be a very, very quick one. And then I'm flying to America, and I'm back next week on the 25th. Normal service may resume on the 26th, but it'll probably resume on the 27th. Until then, folks, take care, and I'm just going to leave you with one other little Easter egg that was spotted on the patch 9.10 test server. Some of you may have noticed that there's a new country flag appearing in the country selector on the carousel at the bottom of the screen. And if you haven't seen it, here it is. That's right, folks. Czechoslovakian tanks are coming. You heard it here first. Unless, of course, you know, you heard it somewhere else, in which case I'll get my coat. Take care, folks, and I'll catch you next time.